Thank you, Speaker, and I'll resume from where I left off just before our lunch adjournment. So, look, over the last 7.5 years since I've been the member in Melton, both the Andrews and Allan Labor governments have delivered in excess of $9 billion of infrastructure and services into the Melton electorate, and I will refer to it later, but we've seen a massive change in the skyline of Melton in regard to that infrastructure build. Of course, I see the complete contrast from those opposite, because while this government is investing in Melton's future, those opposite seem to continue to show people in Melton's West exactly what they think of them. And I'll come to some comments made by the member of Bulleen very shortly. But of course, one of the clearest examples of that is on our public transport, and people in Melton know the pressures of our train line. They live it every single day, packed platforms, overcrowded trains, long commutes, families trying to get into the city for work, students travelling to universities and off to school, and of course many workers spending hours each week commuting because housing affordability has pushed them further away from the city centre and the closer in suburbs and further out from the CBD out to areas like Melton and Wyndham. So of course when people in Melton hear that this government is investing in our rail corridor, they understand how important that is and how important public transport is. And of course the budget just recently announced included a $76 million injection for the next steps towards electrification of the Melton line. And of course that investment doesn't exist in isolation. People can already see the preparation work that's been happening out in that corridor, the level crossing removals. We're seeing 4 level crossings being removed, with one of those being completed and opened as of next Monday in Hopkins Road, which is actually in the electorate of Koroit. And I know my neighbour and the Honourable Ms Grigorovich will be out there opening up that road overpass over the level crossing in Hopkins Road on Monday. Of course, we're seeing the rebuilding of the Melton railway station with extra platforms which will allow for greater capacity and again in preparation for electrified trains. Of course, the planning works that are necessary before electrification can, of course, the building of the stabling yard at Cobblebank, and I'm going out there on Friday where we've just acquired some land for a stabling yard for V-line and electrified trains out at Cobblebank. And these are not promises just floating around, of course, in a media release. These are projects that we can actually physically see happening out there in that growth corridor. And of course, as I said earlier, the skyline in Melton has completely changed in the last 7.5 years. Of course, our government understands that population growth in Melton means we need more capacity, not less, and that matters enormously right across Melbourne's west. And I know that both through the Wyndham and Melton and the population growth, and our population at Melton over the next 20 years is going to double, and I believe that the population by 2046 between Wyndham and Melton will be 1 million people, which will be about 1/10 of the Victorian population. So we can see the pressures on that western corridor of the state. Communities in Melton do not need lectures about transport planning from people who rarely use the network. They understand it backwards, and they understand where the investment needs to go. Of course, this budget recognises that public transport in Melton is not just about the trains into the CBD, it's also about local bus connections, and that matters greatly to our local commuters trying to get from each suburb in the Melton electorate where their families want to go to the schools and the shopping centres, the sports grounds, and if they work locally. That's why our budget delivered a major boost for public transport in Melton South, including 2 new local bus services and bus routes connecting Weir Views, which is a newish suburb in Melton, to the Melton station, and then of course Strathdulla to Cobblebank station. Of course, the budget also upgrades the existing route of 454 service, which increased frequency and an extension through to the Woodgrove Shopping Centre, which is the biggest shopping centre within the Melton Township. And again, it connects people to their work, to their school, to the shopping, to essential services, to their sports clubs. It's really important that those local transport services are provided for our commuters. And of course, when we combine with free public transport for kids under 18, it also gives young people greater independence and flexibility to move around. And we've seen the take-up of that free public transport to be enormous across our electorate. It also takes pressure off families in regard to spending and time for driving kids around by the parents from one side of the township, from one side of Melton to the other, because it's becoming an expanding area, of course. Whereas, again, I think those opposite don't understand the pressures that the free public transport for under 18s and for others during April and May, how that releases some of the pressures on families. Because while this government is investing in more buses and trains with more capacities, those opposite announced that they would cut train services out in the west, in particular in Melton and Wyndham. And those carriages would go elsewhere. And my understanding is that the member for Balloon, who publicly stated on radio that people in Melton, he thinks we have excessive train carriages on our trains, and that he wants to ship them off to the Warrnambool line, which is interesting. And of course, he told the Melton commuters on radio that it would stretch the capacity out in the west. But of course, he's probably not been on a train in Melton. I invite him to come out to Melton and to jump on a train out there and see how they are utilised by our commuters out there. And of course, he wants them to accept overcrowding, and he also wants them to accept reduced capacity. He wants them to accept being treated as less important. And let me tell you, the people of Melton have heard that loud and clear, that the opposition will cut train services in Melton. That's what he stated on radio. They're not my words, they're his words. And of course, effectively, they've become the great train robbers of the West, if that's what their policy is going to do, and that is reduce and take away train carriages from Melton to give to Warrnambool, when again, as I say, our population is going to double over the next 20 years. We need extra capacity, not less capacity, but clearly they do not understand. And while Warrnambool might want more train carriages, that's fine, but so does Melton, a lot more than what Warrnambool will ever need, probably. So, and of course, I was speaking to one of the commuters, a young woman by the name of Claudia at Melton South Station, and she was not impressed about that statement. Of course, neither were many other commuters that we spoke to after the member for Bulleen had made that statement about taking carriages away. And she said, what every person who catches the train to or from Melton already knows, there is not spare capacity sitting around unused. The trains are already crowded. People rely on them every day for work, school, medical appointments and social connection. She knows commuters already struggle finding room on services, particularly during peak periods. So importantly, she was pleased to hear that this government, our government, the Allan Labor government, is investing in longer trains and additional capacity, not ripping services away from growing communities and sending them elsewhere. And of course, our plan is to deliver 9 carriage trains for Melton as of next year. And we're currently expanding the length of some of the platforms at both Cobblebank Station, Rockbank Station, Deer Park's been completed, and I believe Caroline Springs has been completed. So those 9 carriage trains will run on the service in Melton next year. Not, whatever Warrnambool might need, go right ahead. But as far as I'm concerned, we don't need a reduction in carriages, as our communities have already told us. Of course, the transport policy is not abstract in Melton. It's not theoretical. It directly shapes people's daily lives. It shapes how much time parents spend away from their children. It shapes whether somebody can reliably get to work. It shapes household budgets through petrol costs and commuting expenses, and that is why this budget's broader cost of living measures matters so much as well, because families are under pressure right now. We all know that. Interest rates have hurt households. Groceries are expensive. Insurance costs are rising. Fuel prices continue to fluctuate, as we've seen, and in particular with what's going on in the war overseas. And of course, our outer suburban communities like Melton often feel those pressures hardest because people travel further to work and they rely heavily on transport. And that's why the government delivered free public transport during April and May, and that is why this budget includes $278 million to halve the cost of public transport until the 1st of January 2027. Of course, that has been taken up by people, and it is a great move by the government, and people are really appreciative of that cost of living measure. Of course, that's why under-18s can now travel free on public transport across Victoria, and that's been a great policy come in at the start of the year for our kids under 18. And again, the take-up rate has been enormous, not only on the trains but on the buses and trams where required, but certainly the trams in the city. And of course, we're also delivering the 20% registration rebates for Victorian motorists. And of course, some people might dismiss this and these measures individually as small things, but collectively they're not small to families. And families do not experience cost of living pressure as one giant bill arriving all at once. They experience it through hundreds of smaller pressures and a build-up of those pressures, such as fuel costs, school costs, transport, food, uniforms, registration, electricity, childcare, every single week. So when government can reduce some of those pressures, it really matters. And the feedback back to us, and I'm sure all my colleagues, the feedback has been enormous in regard to some of those cost of living measures. And of course, our government will continue to support Victorians, not have a $40 billion cuts like the opposition have proposed, which is frightening for some of our people if going forward, if they feel that there's going to be those cuts come into place. And what does that mean to their cost of living? Of course, my electorate office has already assisted many local families dealing with cost of living through the provision of the school uniforms. People would be surprised how often this issue comes through our electorate office doors. And of course, parents trying to do the right thing, parents working really hard, really struggling at times to pay the bills, parents wanting their kids to feel included at their schools. And of course, uniforms can become incredibly expensive, and of course we know that, and especially when there are multiple children in a household and paying for all of their uniforms. And of course, that's why we've had the Affordable School Uniforms program, and that's why it's so important, and it helps directly to assist families at all of the schools across Melton. And of course, importantly, this government has also acted to reduce unnecessary costs by banning unnecessary uniform logos, which has been one that's been taking up. We had a few issues in Melton at one of our schools, but we've managed to sort that out. But it's a really important thing to families in regard to the logo situation and the provision of uniforms. These bills are really important, obviously, to keep the state moving, to keep investing, to keep providing infrastructure, to delivering to communities like mine out at Melton and right across Victoria. I'm pleased with the budget outcome, in particular for my electorate and, of course, for the broader statewide policies, and I commend this bill to the House.